Welcome to the film analysis, today with Dune Part 2 by Denis Villeneuve. The images impress once more, especially the long shots. Even the biggest screen seems too small for these images. And then there are the close-ups of faces, which couldn't be more nuanced. The acoustic experience is also extraordinary. We are dealing with quite a literal sound film here. Other science fiction and fantasy films reinvent a lot of machinery, but it's a very generic production of some kind of innovation often. Sometimes you think, well, it's already been done in a film before and so on. Dune Part 2 differs from the competition. It uses new parts, objects and things into the picture. Forms that we haven't seen before. In general, this film is sculptural and installative. We often see the individual figures like sculptures and they move through spaces wonderfully lit. We see sunny landscapes painted by artists. Incredible how Villeneuve succeeds time and again in opening pictorial worlds that could exist in their own and would function without people. But then there are people and the dialogue scenes fall short. Villeneuve doesn't vouch for overly verbose dialogue, but here the actors talk an awful lot. To a degree sometimes detracts from the visual impression, as you must concentrate so much on what is being explained in the dialogue. And perhaps this is due to the literary source. Certainly one or two things could have been neglected. Villeneuve could have concentrated more on the visual power and less on what was said. Regarding the story first, Princess Irulan assumes that Paul Atreides could still be alive, and she is right. Her father, Emperor Shaddam IV, no longer speaks a word after the House of Atreides perished with his help. Meanwhile, Paul and Lady Jessica are on Arrakis with Stilgar's Fremen troops. They narrowly escape on an attack by the Harkonnens. For many Fremen, Paul appears to be the long-awaited Messiah, but only the strangers who are religious think so. The unbelievers are far more skeptical. One of these is Shani. Paul fascinates her, but she remains skeptical even when she falls in love with him. Paul can gain Shani's trust when he tells her that he wants to belong to the Fremen, that he wants to be part of the Fremen and that he is not seeking power. Is he really driven by pure idealism to free the Fremen people from oppression and the barren desert world? He will dance in the sand with Shani, a beautiful scene. He will tame a sandworm. There is a love scene between Paul and Shani which is very tender, staged, but unfortunately so discreetly that you can only guess at the passion. Funnily, elsewhere the film takes an incredible amount of time for rather secondary details, for elaborate explanations. In consequence, Shani's and Paul's endeavor often ends up in the film in an abbreviated form. Paul is soon overcome by visions of a holy war and is terrified of it. Will this war come and who will command it? Meanwhile, the power struggle among the Harkonnen increases. This struggle is becoming increasingly brutal. Fate Rautha Harkonnen is someone who loves violence and only seems to be happy when others suffer. He is the very embodiment of fascist rule. But we also see Princess Irulan and Bene Gesserit Gaius Helena Mohiam forging new intrigues and plots in the Emperor's house. And they also rule in an authoritarian and ruthless manner. And that makes the Fremen appear to be the only good guys. But that's not true either. Paul adopts the Fremen customs. He assimilates. Let's not idealize what we saw in the first hour. Here someone is integrating into a very homogeneous community. It is not automatically an emancipatory community just because this community is oppressed by some and by others. Being oppressed doesn't render one necessarily the subject of emancipation. In this way, Denis Villeneuve also criticizes certain forms of anti-colonialist and post-colonialist discourse. These sometimes overlook the repressiveness of some communities. From the academic spectrum in particular, some people like to look the other way because they believe and hope that they are dealing with an emancipatory collective, especially as we also must recognize that the Fremen are not actually a uniform group. As it turns out, a few non-religious people live among them. And then there is the other group of religious people. Stilgar, played by Javier Bardem, belongs to this group. This group is quite prepared for holy war and wants to recognize the Messiah in Paul. Villeneuve thus criticizes post-colonialism and tribalism. This shows that Paul is prepared to assimilate as a sign of politeness. We should not understand this assimilation as a mere expression of respect. Rather, Paul knows that if he appropriates this tribalism, he could perhaps become much more powerful himself. At first, he seems to be traveling in a universalistic way, without wanting to enjoy the power. But at some point, he will decide in favor of power, and in doing so, he betrays universalism. Paul tries to become someone else, but he differs from a famous role model, someone who also walked in the desert, namely Lawrence of Arabia. But Lawrence dissolved in the process. He lost his ego. Paul, on the other hand, gradually becomes someone else through this tribalistic adaptation, and he will have an easy time dominating the Fremen because only a few match Shani and her friend Shishakli. The others are ready for holy war. The identity that the Fremen repeatedly manifest as an imagined collective makes them easy to sway ideologically in one direction or another. But Shani criticizes religion. She thus represents a critique of ideology, while the Bene Gesserit produce ideology. They produce religion for the Fremen and ensure the status quo continues as it is. But we should take a broader view of religion. Dune is directed against fanaticism. Democracy and other forms of rule can also substitute religion. In that case, missionary fervor is not far away. Paul's face tells how he too is suddenly inflamed with missionary zeal. And let's also remember that he receives spice in his food, a raw material that is also a drug. And what is power but a drug? We will return to that in a moment. First, let's talk about the Atreides and the Emperor's family again. It is an elite community, but there is also a certain liberalism. They are power conscious, but then we see that in a state of emergency, people are obsessed with power. Democratic governments also represent themselves first and foremost, even if it is fashionable today to equate citizens and government. The US president is suddenly so filled with power that he no longer wants to recognize his own frailty and runs for office again. So we can observe how power suddenly takes you to completely different levels. Then there are the Harkonnen, forming a fascist collective, or rather one cannot speak of a collective at all, but only of a few dominating the masses. Individuals cease to exist in this mass. Fate Rautha Harkonnen is someone who no longer sees others as people or anything, but only as opponents. The leading figures, not to say politicians, of the Harkonnen, the Emperor and the Fremen are united by what Rutger Bregman explains in his book Humankind: A Hopeful History. Powerful people, politicians, often have pathological personalities. We should take a very critical look at charismatic leaders, as they are often called. Bregman writes, "Power can cause those in power to lose their kindness and humility, virtues on the basis of which they were chosen. See Paul, who exhibits just such virtues to begin with." Bregman writes further, "And in some case these virtues were not there in the first place, because remember, in a hierarchically organized society, Machiavellians possess an advantage. They have an ultimate trump card, always outdoing their competitors. They are shameless." One thing is certain, we see nothing but shameless rulers in the film. The Harkonnens are the most impressive, the most obvious, but the others are also completely shameless in their behavior. Just think of the Bene Gesserit. Bregman further writes that as domesticated humans we carry shame within us, that we are careful about what we do, that we don't want to do something that we have to be ashamed of. He says it could still work well with shame. Bregman continues, "Because shame is more effective than laws and rules, censorship and violence. People who are ashamed regulate themselves. They stutter and blush when they are gossiped about or when they don't fulfill the expectations of those around them." End of quote. Think of all the close-ups we see of Timothée Chalamet's face when he's with the Fremen, when he's getting used to the rituals. But when he repeatedly shows uncertainty, we observe a person who is ashamed in a healthy way. But he gradually sheds this shame later. Bregman continues, "Unfortunately, there are always people who lack any sense of shame. I'm talking about people who are drugged with power, or a small minority who were born with sociopathic traits." And we witness both groups of people in the film. The book continues, "Politicians who have no sense of shame can do things that are simply impossible for others." Bregman asks, "Do you call yourself the greatest thinker in the country? Do you brag about the greatness of your genitals? Do you lie? Do you get caught and then shamelessly continue to lie?" Most people would sink into the ground, just as most people wouldn't take the last biscuit out of the bowl. But some rulers wouldn't care at all. In such a world, it is no longer the friendliest and the most sympathetic leaders who rise to the surface. In such a world, it is rather the other way around, survival of the shameless. And that's what Denis Villeneuve shows us for 2.5 hours. Apart from Shani, we only see shameless personalities, the blushing, the showing of weakness that will also change in Timothée Chalamet's face. We will hardening there, and we will see hardening there, and at the same time we will be able to read the disappointment in Zendaya's face. But Shani is not an heroine in the sense of a leader. Frank Herbert, the author of Dune, once said the following: "I wrote the Dune series because I had this idea that charismatic leaders ought to come with a warning label on their forehead. May be dangerous to your health." One of the most dangerous presidents we had in this century was John Kennedy, because people said, yes, "Sir, Mr. Charismatic Leader, what do we do next?" And we wound up in Vietnam. And I think probably the most valuable president of this century was Richard Nixon, because he taught us to distrust government, and he did it by example. Villeneuve has understood this logic and applies it to Dune. And we need this film so much today because the media are once again in the process of blindly following people who pose as saviors of democracy or the like. The camera also criticizes ideology by repeatedly adopting Shani's gaze. We are also supposed to fall in love with the charismatic leader Paul, and we do. But it is Shani's gaze, the gaze we observe, that become clouded as Paul gradually changes. The film doesn't tell us a hero's journey and is therefore fundamentally different from the usual blockbusters. And then there is this enormous expanse in this film. We see the camera traveling across the desert just when a large sandworm is called. Tremendous scenes that have never been seen before in the cinema. The special thing about Dune is how archaic and high-tech coexist or come together here. And we can also see that in the present day we have state-of-the-art nuclear weapons and drones, but at the same time we are still beating each other to death with a folding spade. People are a resource that can be wasted, like living ammunition. Now you can discuss, and you should, whether this film doesn't have considerable narrative weaknesses. After all, the second part is not the end, there must be a third. And yes, the sometimes overly expensive dialogue hurt the film. It's easy to criticize the film according to film critical criteria applied to a science fiction blockbuster. There are strange omissions and jumps. At the same time, minor conflicts or instructions are stretched. Then the camera looks at the landscape again for a very long time, and even longer and even longer. Suddenly we have traveled a long distance, both spatially and narratively, without realizing exactly how we got from one place to another. This could undoubtedly be seen as a shortcoming of the film, but that would be missing the point. It is primarily a film about geopolitics and the contingency of the geopolitical situation, because people always like to say afterwards, this was planned long in advance, this attack, this war, whatever. But what's interesting is that we are always confronted with suddenness, and we finally end up with these retrospective formulations. It was planned for a long time. Maybe, but suddenness characterizes the geopolitical field of conflict. Paul's choice of bride is just one example of this contingency of history. Certainly the clearest example, but this film constantly works with long shots on a desert landscape, leaving us to think nothing was moving. Suddenly something appears. This suddenness mixes everything up. Completely new power constellations emerge. What's more, we must understand this film as a very clear commentary on our present day, because the film also talks about nuclear weapons, and that every ruling house has them. At some point, given the danger of nuclear weapons, something changes abruptly. There was an omission or two, something wasn't communicated properly, everything changed, and the catastrophe began. We are looking at sandy landscapes here. A grain of sand is ultimately part of weathered rock that has been honed by the sun and water. It is the greatest possible contrast to the acting subject, which stands for activity. Sand is the product of pure passivity. The wind and the sandworms move the sand, but it does not move itself. But to what extent do the people of the various nations move? It is questionable whether we are dealing with acting subjects here, because these people are moved by their rulers, the rulers of the Atreides, the Harkonnen and the Fremen. In this respect, this is a highly interesting reflection on what drives the story, who moves whom here. And this film makes the greatest possible contrast with the sand and the individual ruler figures. Villeneuve masters this contrast brilliantly. The aesthetics excel. The faces change. That is why the close-ups are not simply a convention, but crucial to telling a story, especially when it comes to the relationship between Paul, played by Timothée Chalamet, and Shani, played by Zendaya. They are in love. In love, things change suddenly, and you no longer know what happened. And then it's over. Something is there. The author, Roger Willemsen, called it the crack. We can see this crack in the close-ups, while at the same time this crack is also what may occur in a geopolitical intrigue. Suddenly everything is different and war breaks out. In Dune Part 2, the private level is also political. It's not about these are the good guys, these are the bad guys. Therefore, Dune Part 2 fundamentally differs from the Star Wars universe. Now, after a total of 5 hours of Dune, we think to ourselves, what's next? The hero's journey went astray. The revolution failed to materialize. Repression and regression follow. Yes, we must wait for a third part, but part 2 doesn't have a narrative weakness. In that sense, it shows us how we reach dead ends with our usual thought patterns, how we don't get anywhere by simply reinforcing what hasn't worked before, quantitatively and qualitatively. Dune Part 2 thus shows the global constellation of our present. Firstly, there is the supposedly responsible West, the Atreides. Yes, the West has become deeply entangled in exploitation and guilt, from war deaths to victims of climate change, to continue our spice mining. And an emperor who doesn't speak, or a president that speaks with many slips of the tongue, what's the difference? And Paul? He stands for the young politician who is staged in the media as a superhero, but who will soon be drunk with power. Secondly, there is fascism. It is on the rise in many parts of the world and on our doorstep. For more and more people, especially men, the realm of the Harkonnen seems desirable. Thirdly, there is the sacred tribalist Fremen warrior. And these Fremen warriors are reminiscent of Islamist and evangelical fundamentalist groups whose supposed struggle for liberation does not lead to freedom. So we hope for Shani. May she not become a hero, but may she carry the torch of enlightenment so that we don't watch but see. It would be nice if you would like to support the film analysis financially. You can do so via my bank account or PayPal. Also, you can find me on Patreon. Thank you very much.